There is a groove. You have heard it without knowing its name. It shows up in hip-hop records from the 1,980 seconds, and 1,990 seconds, and 2,000 seconds. A slapped bass line underneath a Fender Rhodes that seems to float just slightly ahead of the beat. A drum pattern that sits exactly where a sampler wants it. For 30 years, producers across New York and London and Tokyo reached into crates and pulled out the same Brazilian records and built their music on top of them. The band was called Azymuth. They were from Rio de Janeiro, and for most of those 30 years, the royalties never found their way back. Before we go further, Brazilian music runs deeper than most people realize. It invented the groove that built whole genres. It charted in countries where nobody knew the language, and it did all of this from a city that the world treated as scenery. If that story is new to you, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe and stay. This channel is where the real history lives. Azymuth came together in Rio de Janeiro in 1973. Three musicians, José Roberto Bertrami on keyboards, Fender Rhodes, synthesizers, the whole analog palette of the era. Alex Malheiros on bass, playing with a precision and warmth that immediately set him apart from the jazz fusion players of the moment. And Conti, known as Mamão, on drums and percussion. Mamão had a rhythmic instinct that was rare even in Rio, a city where rhythm is not a skill but an inheritance. All three had been working in the Brazilian music industry for years before they came together as a unit. Bertrami had played sessions across Rio, absorbing the harmonic language of MPB while pushing toward the electric textures that American jazz fusion was building at the same time. Malheiros brought a bass sensibility that was simultaneously funk and samba. Muscular but melodic, always rhythmically alive. Together, they were something the Brazilian music scene had not quite seen before. The sound they made was not easily categorized. It was not straight samba. It was not American jazz fusion, though it borrowed the electric instruments and the freedom of improvisation. It was not MPB in the traditional sense. What it was, specifically, was a music that understood samba at the cellular level and then rebuilt it with synthesizers and studio electronics and a groove sensibility that was entirely their own. They signed with Milestone Records in the United States, a label known for serious jazz, and began releasing records through the late 1970 seconds. In Brazil, they were respected. In the wider world, they were a curiosity. A Brazilian trio making instrumental music that did not fit the bossa nova narrative that most international listeners had for Brazilian music. Then came 1979. The album was called Light as a Feather. The track that changed everything was called Jazz Carnival. Jazz Carnival is a 3-minute instrumental. It opens with a bass line and builds into something that feels inevitable. The kind of groove that does not announce itself so much as arrive and refuse to leave. In January of 1980, it entered the UK singles chart. It peaked at number 19. A Brazilian instrumental jazz funk record with no lyrics, no singer, no crossover concession. 19 on the British chart. It stayed there for 20 weeks. This was almost without precedent. A Brazilian instrumental record, no lyrics, no vocals, no obvious crossover move, had reached the British mainstream. British pop radio played Jazz Carnival. British listeners bought it. DJs spun it at clubs without necessarily knowing where it came from. And then it disappeared from the mainstream conversation as quickly as it had arrived, because the music industry of 1980 did not have a category for what Azymuth was doing. There was no Brazilian jazz funk section in the record stores. There was no radio format for it. The chart position was real. The infrastructure to build on it was not. But the record diggers noticed. The crate hunters who moved through import shops in New York and warehouse sales in London and market stalls in Tokyo. They found the Azymuth records, and they recognized something that the mainstream had missed. This music was built for sampling, the Fender Rhodes voicing, the way Mamão's snare sat in the mix, the bass tone that Malheiros had developed, round, present, just slightly overdriven. When you lifted a 4-bar loop from an Azymuth record and put it under a drum machine, it sounded like it had been waiting for that drum machine. It sounded like it had been designed for this use, which of course it had not. That is just what a great groove does. Through the 1,980 seconds and into the 1,990 seconds, samples from the Azymuth catalog appeared in hip-hop and dance records across the Atlantic world. O.S.T.R, one of the most significant figures in Polish hip-hop, sampled them for Sen. Houz'Mon built Deep No. 2 on an Azymuth groove. The list grew. The trio from Rio did not grow wealthy from these uses. The clearance infrastructure that would eventually govern sampling was still being built. Labels were slow. Contracts were incomplete. The royalties rarely found their way back to Rio. This is not an unusual story. It is the story of how global music moved in the pre-clearance era. Material traveled faster than money. Grooves crossed borders that royalty checks could not follow. What makes Azymuth's case particular is the scale. 30 years of influence, one of the most sampled Brazilian catalogs in existence, and a band that most of the people sampling them had never seen perform. The recognition that did come arrived in an unexpected form. In the mid-2000s, the American producer Madlib, one of the most important figures in underground hip-hop, a man whose sampling instincts had made him a legend in crate-digging culture, flew to Rio de Janeiro to meet Ivan Conti. He did not send an email. He went to Brazil. The collaboration they made together was released in 2008 under the name Jackson Conti. The album was called Houz'Mon. It was Madlib's beats built around Ivan Conti's percussion, live drums meeting sample culture across a table in Rio. Two diggers from different continents realizing they had been working with the same materials. Houz'Mon did not sell millions of copies. It was a cult record for cult listeners. But it represented something that the previous 30 years had not. An acknowledgement, direct and unhurried, that the music Azymuth had made in Rio was essential. That Mamão's drumming was not just a sample source, it was a vision. José Roberto Bertrami died in 2012. He was 69 years old. He had kept arranging and recording into his final years, building on a catalog that had quietly shaped the sound of popular music in ways that his name was rarely attached to. Ivan Conti died in 2023. The obituaries that ran in the music press were longer than they would have been 20 years earlier. The crate-digging community had spent decades making the case for Azymuth, and by the time Mamão died, the argument had been won. Malheiros is still playing. Azymuth continues to perform and record under the Far Out Recordings banner, the British label that had been championing their catalog for years before the broader world caught up. The lineup that takes the stage today carries the weight of everything that came before. Bertrami at the Rhodes, Mamão behind the drums, in the muscle memory of the players who were there, and the spirit of those who are not. The Far Out reissues brought the original records to a new generation. Vinyl pressings, careful liner notes, the full context that the original milestone releases had never quite provided. Young producers who had grown up sampling second-generation rips of Azymuth grooves could now hear the originals the way they were meant to be heard, on 12-inch vinyl, at the volume Bertrami and Malheiros and Mamão had imagined when they tracked the sessions in Rio. The groove does not age. That is the thing about Azymuth that matters most. You can hear Jazz Carnival today and it does not sound like a museum piece. It sounds like something someone made this year, in a studio that understood exactly what it was doing. The electric piano still floats. The bass still slaps into the pocket. Mamão's snare still lands exactly where you need it to land, which is the final irony of the Azymuth story. They were too early for the world that would eventually love them. They invented a sound that would define decades of music after them, and they did it from a city that the music industry treated as scenery, with instruments that the jazz establishment considered too commercial, making music that the pop world considered too complicated. They did it anyway. And somewhere in a crate, someone is still finding them for the first time. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. The crates are full.